Tena koto. In this video, we're going to think about digital media and history. It might seem odd that a course about how digital media affects the present starts by thinking about the past, but understanding how digital media has changed over time and how narratives are constructed from those changes is really important for understanding today's media. I'm going to briefly introduce 4 ways of thinking about digital media and history. History as progress, as end mediation and convergence, as distinct periods, and finally, as a series of digital divides. The history of digital media is often approached in terms of progress, as a series of technological innovations which increase in sophistication and complexity, so history becomes a straightforward tale of improvement. There's undoubtedly some truth behind this. The cost of processing 1 billion calculations has fallen from over $18 billion in 1961 to 3 cents in 2017. Global internet traffic has grown from 0.01 petabytes per year in 1990 to 160 million by 2016. One piece of evidence that's often used to support this view of digital history is Moore's law, a prediction that was made in 1975 that the number of transistors on an integrated circuit would double every 2 years, and that's more or less held until today. Variants of Moore's law project this exponential increase back to the earliest days of mechanical computing and forwards in time to a speculative point in the future where a computer will supposedly surpass the brain power of every living human, a moment referred to as the singularity, when technological change will supposedly bring about radical social changes that we can't even begin to imagine. This kind of extrapolation from the past into the future is quite problematic though. It assumes that trends simply continue and can't be changed, so it's a form of teleological technological determinism. We can't simply extrapolate the future by drawing a straight line on a graph. Can you think of any good examples that would demonstrate this? A second way of thinking about the history of digital media is through convergence and end mediation. This looks at how over time computers have converged with other technologies like analog media and telecommunication networks, first with copper telephone networks and more recently with mobile networks and locative satellite systems. This process continues with the construction of the Internet of Things, where digital networks today are becoming increasingly embedded across the scales of the smart city, the smart home, and the quantified self. What we see through this lens is a process whereby over time, more and more of our societies, cultures and identities are mediated through digital technology. Whereas media was once associated with particular spaces, places and devices, today everywhere and everything seems to be becoming networked. We'll think more about some of these changes about digital media, space, time and mobility in week 4 of the course. There's a danger, though, that this historical perspective gives us another form of unidirectional progress, where we almost inevitably move towards the end mediation of everything. Can you think of any good examples where instead of convergence, digital media produces divergence and fragmentation? A third way of thinking about digital history is periodization. This divides digital history into numerous successive eras. Mainframe computing in the 1960s and 70s, desktop personal computing in the 1980s, the World Wide Web and early wired network computing of the 1990s, the post-dot-com bubble era of Web 2.0 in the early 2000s, and smartphones, social media platforms and surveillance capitalism since about 2007. This kind of periodic division provides some degree of nuance, potentially but not necessarily avoiding the problematic assumption that each period is simply better. However, periodization can be criticized for erecting artificial boundaries. For example, many of today's social media platforms came into being during the Web 2 period. Web 2 was widely criticized as just continuing elements of earlier network computing and so on. This neat organization of messy and complex historical processes always erases important details. A final way of thinking about digital history addresses inequality and divisions. For a long time, these debates focused on access. In 2000, there were still only 350 million global internet users, who were heavily concentrated in urban areas within wealthy countries, so the digital divide was whether you had access or not. And there are still significant disparities around access today. Over 90% of New Zealanders have internet access, whereas less than 5% of people in some of the world's poorest countries do. But by 2019, there are over 4.5 billion internet users worldwide, so debates about inequality have shifted from simply having access to what type of access. Different connection forms like broadband, 3, 4 or 5G cellular, dial-up and satellite all afford different types of networked activity, as do the different technologies that are employed to create and consume digital media. These range from professional production tools that cost tens of thousands of dollars, through high-end smartphones and laptops, to budget and second-hand computers, tablets and phones that are available to less privileged people. While this last group tends to be capable of producing text and low-resolution images, they're mainly geared towards consuming rather than creating media. Another way of thinking about digital inequality surrounds data. While early models of the internet focused on decentralization, today a handful of wealthy corporations like Google, Facebook and Amazon occupy near monopoly positions. These corporations collate enormous volumes of data about us, but the data they control and the algorithms they employ are closely guarded secrets. This situation, where a handful of American corporations enjoy immense amounts of centralized power, while users often just have to deal with the consequences of those corporations' actions, is a long way away from early visions of all internet users being communicative equals. In fact, the current situation has been described by media theorists Nick Couldry and Ulysses Magias as data colonialism. We'll think more about those questions around data and power in next week's course materials. This way of thinking about digital history presents a narrative whereby some forms of digital inequality, like access, have decreased over time, whereas others, like the centralization of corporate power, have increased. Rather than a straightforward narrative of progress, this suggests that things improve in certain ways while also becoming worse in others. In summary then, there are numerous ways that we can frame digital history, and how we do so provides very different perspectives on the present and the future. One thing that becomes clear is that history is not just a set of neutral facts, but a place where different arguments about technology, society and power are both advanced and contested.